Welcome, Dr. Koraly Perez-Edgar, to the Parenting for the Present podcast. We are so excited to have you. You are a professor of psychology at Penn State and currently in College Station, Texas, for a really cool conference called the Occasional Temperament Conference. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. We can't get our act together to do it on a regular basis, so we just get together occasionally.
I love it, the Occasional Temperament Conference. So we got to talk about Kyle Field and all things Aggies, which Matthew and Eve thought was fantastic before
Of
the
course.
episode. Dr. Perez Edgar, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and kind of your work at Penn State?
Sure. So I am the mom of two kids. I barely can call them kids right now because they're 24 and almost 21. So I'm sort of maybe seeing the light on the other end of the tunnel, but not totally. Which is interesting for me because I've done my entire career studying early development and its prediction of later social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. So this is the first time I've been able to see it unfold right in front of my eyes for 2 decades. I'm at Penn State. I am a professor of psychology there, and my lab studies early temperament, its biological correlate, and how these underlying biological substrates shape our social and emotional behavior, and how temperament serves as that biological foundation for personality.
For me as a psychologist in the group, temperament is like, I get really excited anytime I can learn more about temperament because we see a lot of students in our office, with ADHD and anxiety and autism and, taking away those clinical diagnoses and just understanding the child and then understanding the child vis-a-vis the parents and seeing
Mhm.
the parents here and seeing their temperamental factors and how it's passed down. I've been so excited to have you on. And I guess my first question would be, what is the most important thing? And this is going to be either a softball or a really hard curveball. What's the hardest thing for parents to understand about temperament, do you think?
I think there are two things that I think are contradictory but important. One, that temperament is real, that it's biologically based, that we as parents, when you're pregnant, when you see that newborn and the infant, we have these dreams about who they will be like, who they will take after, what their traits will be. And we don't necessarily have complete control over that. And that our child is going to introduce themselves to us over time. And we're going to have to get to know who they actually are. Um, and particularly if you've had more than one child, that process begins anew with that second child. The second child is never a clone of the first. So temperament is real, it's biologically based. At the same time, it does not mean that the parents have no role to play in how temperament unfurls over time, how we can take the strengths and possibilities that our child is showing us and enhance them and allow them to really use that to their full potential. And notice those things that might make life a little bit more difficult for them. And rather than trying to change them, helping them learn to cope with it, to regulate, and to work around those challenges. So, temperament is real. Your child will introduce himself to you, and then you two can get to know each other and shape who they will become.
How do you define temperament? And as a parent, how
Mhm.
do I know what is the temperament between my children?
Right. So, if we're going to go into sort of the dictionary version of what temperament is, it is three specific pillars. One, it's biologically based. You're going to see, well, not in everyday life, but if you went into a lab, you would see underlying neural, physiological, cardiac, hormonal measures that vary between children. Oh, so if you talk to parents of 6 month olds, 9 month olds, they'll tell you, my child is a good sleeper. My child is easily soothed. My child is very anxious around strangers. My child responds to loud noises more than other children. Those are different types of temperamental traits. Parents pick up on that. The third pillar is that it's relatively stable over time and over locations. So some children tend to be shy across the board, as opposed to kids who are shy in specific situations. Um, for parents, you're not going to see the biological components of it, but you're seeing that behavior. You're seeing the patterns of your child. And I think most parents pick up on that intuitively. What does it take to get my child to sleep, for example? Some children, miraculous children, I don't think I had one, where you,
We
oh,
call those unicorn babies
right, the unicorn babies. I
that
place
sleep.
them in the crib, I turn off the lights, I say night, night, and I walk out.
I
Okay.
never have I ever in my house.
Right, right. But they
Oh
exist.
my
They
God.
do exist. They do exist. And then the other babies that really need you to scaffold, right, that sleep process night after night. Or when they're a little bit older, do they go to a, mommy and me class, and do they run right in and go up to another kid and just start playing and kind of forget mommy's there? Or are they the child that literally needs you to hold their hand and walk them through that integration into that social setting? Parents know that. They just don't label it the way we would as pediatricians or clinicians or a psychologist in the lab.
Are there certain labels for different temperaments?
Yes.
Specifically, how do we label that really difficult, strong-willed child that doesn't listen to anything and just is a
You're just
low-key
asking for
terrorist?
a friend, Eve?
Just asking for a friend.
That's
I
right.
don't have
Yeah.
one of those.
And
I'm a
it's
perfect parent.
but no, but that's the thing. It's not about you as a parent,
That's
right?
right.
So it oddly enough, we do have a label, and I hate using the word label, but we do have a category that we just literally call difficult, a difficult
And
temperament.
is it
These are
still
children.
difficult? Because it's always been difficult, but I just
I
wondered if it's moved from difficult. Because it used to
Also
right.
be
asking for a friend.
easy,
Right.
Yeah.
difficult, slow to warm up. So
Yes.
I'm curious.
No, and we do use those. So a lot of the children, so let me go in order. So like a difficult child or difficult temperament. I want to correct myself there, right?
Yeah.
I made an error there that I want to make sure people listen to. I should not have said difficult child, because it is not the child, it is their temperament. We all have temperamental traits, and we all have different temperamental profiles. Whether we want to label them differently, then fine, but it's not the child. The child isn't a thing in that sense. So a
Yes.
difficult temperament is often considered highly reactive. So when something happens in the environment, their emotional and physiological response is quite intense. They are the children who will cry very intensely when something happens, or are quick to anger, and that many things in their daily life could trigger that response. And then once triggered, it's very difficult for them to then down regulate, right? They go way up and then they have trouble coming down. We often think of that as a difficult temperament, um, which we can compare to, as you already said, Matthew, the slow to warm up child, which is a phrase often used by Jerry Kagan, who was one of my advisors when I was in school. And this is the child that if you saw them in the family setting, they have a place, they're comfortable, they're social beings there, right? This is not the child with very extreme social deficits. But bring them into the classroom, bring them into scouts, bring them into tumbling class. They cling to their parent. They are reluctant to join in the other kids. And it might take 1, 3, 5, 7 sessions of this class for them to become comfortable with these novel social individuals. Literally, it takes them a while to warm up. And then, of course, you have the easygoing infant. Again, rarely do we meet them. And these are infants that tend to have low levels of a behavioral or emotional response to events in their environment. And it's kind of hard to tell if they're good regulators or if they don't actually even need to regulate because they never get, riled up. Um, there could be issues there too over time, but those are three categories that you kind of encounter out in the wild.
And statistically, Koraly, is it a third, a third, a third? I can't remember this.
No. Well, so for the slow to warm up, if you think about the fearful child, the behaviorally
Yeah.
inhibited child, it's about 15 to 20%.
All right.
Um, for the highly irritable, difficult, reactive temperament, 10 to 15.
Okay.
Most of us are in that just broad middle, right? Living our lives and doing our best. Um, you do
Interesting.
also see another category that about 10%, 10 to 15, exuberant. And these are the kids that are just, they seem to be highly positive, also very active, and seem to just thrive on interaction and sensory input. Um, Part of us as parents in the United States think, oh, that's wonderful. These are the sociable leaders that are just going to be captain of every club and everybody's going to love them. But they're also the risk takers. They're also the ones that we need to kind of teach to slow down and think about, is this really something you want to do, right? Is this something that could have negative consequences? So you have that exuberant child, you have the inhibited child, you have the reactive child, and then you have what we sometimes call the California babies, right? They're just like, que será, será, right? Like we're just going on with the flow.
That's
YOLO.
that's great.
Oh,
So you have talked, I think, and tell me if I'm misquoting you,
Mhm.
that temperament is the starting point, not the destiny. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean when you say that?
Sure. So the thing about temperament, it's because it's early appearing, we sometimes worry or assume that it has imprinted something onto our child that makes them show a particular behavioral profile or emotional response. And that's just it. It's like I was born with black hair and brown eyes. Done, right? But not everything biological is static. Just because it has a biological foundation doesn't mean it can't be shaped. And so when we think about temperament, it really creates what I would say are probabilities. So a child who is born particularly shy or slow to warm up is unlikely to become the naturally gregarious, exuberant child that automatically and naturally engages with the social world. But that doesn't mean they're going to be a recluse. It doesn't mean they're going to have clinical social anxiety. It means they will learn to regulate and cope. They will learn their niche in their environment, and they will learn how to create those close relationships that sustain them and allow them to navigate their social world. So I would argue that I am naturally an inhibited and shy person. But because of my career, because of what I'm expected to do, I've learned how to, for an hour at a time, 2 hours at a time, emote, speak with others, engage in a social interaction. And then when my battery is depleted, lie down in the dark and go back to my normative state, right? Um, but for some people, they don't need to do that. They build off of the social interaction. And so for them, it's learning, what do I do when I'm with myself? And I have to be in this quiet state. That's not their natural state, but they got to learn to do that too.
yeah,
What
our
is
personal example of that is our the most inhibited of our family is the only one who's jumped out of an airplane
Yes.
from a temperamental perspective.
Yeah.
So it's true. It's really, it's nice to see kind of the growth and development. I think it's always interesting also to think about a parent-child temperament and
Hmm.
how those similar temperaments are sometimes problematic and, different temperaments. Do you do much work with parent-child temperament?
Not personally. I tend to focus on children, but
Yeah,
a lot of the work I'm starting to do now is looking at that dyadic interaction. And I
yeah,
think we have a long history of thinking about it conceptually, but not really focusing on it as much empirically. And one of the things we've always thought about, and the term that's been used for decades, is goodness of fit.
yes.
For most children, there is this nice, beautiful leeway where parents don't have to be perfect, right? It's not as if a single child has the bad luck of not getting the perfect parent, they're doomed, which is great because there are no perfect parents. But it is that parent that is sensitive to the needs of the child that can work with the child to both accommodate some of the child's needs while at the same time scaffolding the child to learn how to be part of that social environment, right? So we don't necessarily allow the child to be unregulated and fully their authentic selves, quote unquote, because they do have to fit into a social structure and a social world. So, goodness of fit does not necessarily mean that the parent and the child have the same temperament or the same
Yeah.
personality. And as have you alluded to, that can be bad. Like if you have a very, very anxious parent with a highly fearful child, you've just increased the probability that that child is going to become clinically anxious because
Mhm.
everything that they're exposed to in the work in the daily life and how the parent introduces them to the world is introducing them to a world of fear and of potential threat. And kids are logical. If you tell me my world is scary and threatening, well, I'm going to withdraw, right? There's no need to advance. Sometimes if you have two parents that and a child who are very exuberant and outgoing and used to being large and in charge, that can also butt heads. So it's not that the parent and the child have the same temperament or personality, is that the parent is able to see themselves as an independent person from their child and can see how they need to navigate and adapt to the needs of the child and do so in a way that is supportive of and mindful of both their needs, right? So we're not asking the parent to change who they are, nor
Yeah.
are we asking the parent to try and change who the child is. They're both adapting.
Your research has shown how parenting strategies and reactions can either reinforce or reshape child's fear responses. Can you talk
Mhm.
a little bit more about that and how that overprotective response, even when motivated by love, can actually reinforce the fear and avoidance? And how should parents practice that gentle courage building instead? Because we see a lot of that in our practice.
Sure. And there are a number of researchers and clinicians looking into this. And I think I used the word before of accommodating, that when we as parents, I mean, we truly love our children. We want for the best for them. And sometimes our instinct is to be protective of them so they do not have to experience things that we see as overly negative and harsh and overwhelming. That's totally understandable, right? Um, but there is this possibility that we can overprotect our children and place them in what could be called a bubble of safety. And that bubble, rather than helping them, is a trap because they never learn the independent skills they need to interact with the world, to understand their own strengths, to
Yeah.
understand that I am capable of dealing with my social world and that I can, step by step, little by little, walk into being independent as an adolescent, as a young adult. Um, so, for example, if you had the child going into tumbling class and you walk in and the child cries, they're overwhelmed by tumbling class. They don't want to go in with the other children, they want to sit with you. If your response to that is to say, don't worry, honey, we will never have to do tumbling class again. We're just going to go home. And then you say, well, my baby doesn't do well in these social interactions, so we're not going to do scouts. We're not going to do play dates. We're not going to do the things that are, it's too much for them. And you're right, in a sense, it is too much for them. But if your response is to never then try again, it will always be too much for them. And so it
Yeah.
may be that in tumbling class, you have to sit next to them for the first 3 or 4 lessons. It may be that while other moms drop off their kids, go to Starbucks, pick up something at Target, come back and pick them up, and the child has not even noticed that they've left, you're going to be sitting there like sweating it out, trying to get them to engage. And maybe you have to do two classes. And maybe it's over a month the child learns it's okay. But guess what? That means next year when you sign them up for tumbling class again, they might not only need a session or two with you by their side. By the third session, by the third cycle, they'd be like, Mom, I can walk in by myself. I don't need you to walk me in. That's what you want. I mean, it's going to break your heart a little bit when it happens, but you want them to be able to say, No worries, I got this. And you want to do it in a developmentally appropriate way. Because what you don't want is that first day of kindergarten when the child is screaming because they've never let your side. And now you're at the point where it is no longer an option. And you didn't give them the skills to face what now they have to because you let it go.
What do you think are the top three ways you find parents accommodating for those kind of younger kids?
Um, Minimizing or shrinking their social world. They only interact with mom, dad, grandma, and their sibling, right? They have a very limited sense of people are different. People act in weird ways. I need to learn how to read social cues, how to understand why people act the way they do, in a developmentally appropriate way. Um, and that I will act differently with different people. If the world around you has been shaped to your liking, because grandma knows you like this and mom knows you like that, and dad will bring you the blanket that's your favorite. When you interact with others that don't accommodate or understand those needs, it's going to be a shock to you. So that's one, a very limited, tight social circle. Two is yes, you acknowledge emotion. Yes, you acknowledge the fact that little kids have difficulty regulating emotion. We don't want to adultify children, but we also want to teach them little by little how to regulate their emotions in a way that's socially appropriate and also appropriate for themselves. It is overwhelming to have a tantrum. It is overwhelming to be highly scared. And it's too much to place on a child to not help them learn how to regulate when they feel like they're going to get a tantrum or how to make themselves feel better when they're really scared. We're not equipping them with the tools they need. And although we do it out of love, it's not fair to the child.
Mm.
Always be
I'm
there to be that scaffold.
I'm always interested in this intersection of COVID, child development,
Mhm.
and you said something that made me think about, when you have that small social circle for children. And I have a COVID baby. I have a
Mhm.
2020 baby. And so naturally, she kind of had that, even though she's very strong-willed. She has the really hard temperament. But in your experience, in your research,
Mhm.
are you seeing like what is that intersection
And
in your
what
opinion?
what's interesting about, COVID in particular is that the data are coming out and they're not clear because you can look at COVID in certain ways. You can look at what about the babies that were born right at the beginning of COVID and their early experiences were much different than, say, babies born just a year earlier. They're not going to daycare necessarily. They're not engaging in some of those broader social interactions. You can think about the kids who were in kindergarten during COVID that had that, first real introduction to structured school interrupted. For kids, who are older, so for example, for my oldest child, COVID hit when they were a freshman in college. We got a phone call, come get me, they're closing the dorms, right? And the impact of that has been different, in part based on their age, but also based on their temperament. What we find is that for the vast majority of kids, they're quite adaptable and they are returning to what we think of in terms of social, um, not that different than previous cohorts. You do have subtle signs of some social interaction difficulties, particularly in adolescents who really relied on social media as a way of engaging with peers. For those kids who engaged with peers in social media, which was helpful, right? It kept their anxiety levels lower, but then transitioned back to in-person social interactions, they're doing well. For the child who retreated into social media and never came back out, those are the adolescents that are having the biggest difficulty. Academically, there are some kids that are still having trouble, particularly if they didn't get that nice, strong foundation, reading, writing, arithmetic. And that's important from my world because academic troubles in school often lead to social concerns and vice versa. School is a
Mhm.
very tricky environment. You have to kind of know what you know academically and know what you know socially, and the two of them can interact to both to amplify each other and to bring each other down. Nobody likes to go and study in a place that they don't feel comfortable.
So one of the things you've
You've
talked
said
about in
that.
some of your writing and some of your, sorry, Eve's speaking over you, but I was this concept of stepping in versus stepping back. Could you talk to the
Mhm.
audience about that as it relates to responding to your child's temperament or anxious behaviors?
Right. Um, I think the worst part of parenting is that there's no right answer and you're usually going to feel like you did it wrong, right? Um, one of the things about parenting a child based on their temperament is trying to be attuned to when do they need you in that moment to step in, to be a scaffold for them and help them deal with some issue or concern that they are struggling with. And when is it that you need to step back and allow them to struggle, that the growth is coming in that struggle. I know when you're doing clinical work with adults, you often talk about exposure therapy, right? So that if you're anxious, you're going to get homework. You're going to go into a store and ask the cashier a question. And you're going to be really anxious about it and you're going to be nervous. But doing that is part of your treatment, learning to overcome that anxiety. And for a parent, when it's developmentally appropriate, is allowing that child to struggle and to deal with that peer that is a bit annoying, to deal with the teacher who's a little harsh, to struggle with the task that makes them frustrated, that you don't necessarily then walk in and do the task for them. Understanding when there's a peer conflict that they should learn to work out, or when it escalates to the point that the parent has to step in. When it's one thing to have the grumpy teacher versus the teacher that's not being developmentally appropriate and is putting too many expectations on the children in that classroom. And that is really hard, right? We don't want to be helicopter parents. We don't want to smooth out every step along the way for this child so they never learn those skills, but we also don't want to feed our children to the wolves.
Yeah.
And some children will need more scaffolding than others, but your job is to step away. Your job is to slowly but surely get to the point where they need you less and less instrumentally. They might need you as a parent who loves them and who will give them advice, but they shouldn't need you to hold their hands physically or metaphorically to engage in the social world um, as they get older.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things parents struggle with the most because usually when you're needing to step in or step back, it's usually there's a lot of emotion around it. And so when our
Hmm.
kids are dysregulated, it's so much harder. So
Yeah.
I think just as parents educating and kind of using a community around your parenting of,
Yeah.
hey, this is going on. I remember one of our 4-year-olds would not get on the stage at the Christmas party. And I stepped in and got on the stage, and we still have funny pictures of Dr. Houston on the stage with anxious child. So it's hard, but those are the moments that sometimes it's hardest to do it.
Hmm.
But
Yes.
it's critical.
Yeah. And your child stayed on stage and can now say proudly, I was in the
Yeah.
Christmas pageant, right? Which is a stepping stone to maybe in the future not needing, right,
Yeah.
a parent standing with them on stage. Um, which I think is a really critical thing that it's okay to support your children. Sometimes I use the analogy of learning to swim, right? That there's this middle ground. We don't say that you're going to pick up your preschooler, walk to the deep end of the pool and just like throw them in and go for it, swim, right? They're going to drown. You're going to have to jump in after them. They're not equipped. But at the same time, you can't sit on the edge of the pool forever, just getting your feet wet and just saying, "Don't worry, baby, we don't have to get wet if you don't want to get wet. We're just going to sit here and I'm going to sit next to you forever." Because one day you're not going to be sitting next to them anymore. And what happens if they get in the water and they're not equipped to swim, right? You need to show them how to swim. You need to show them gradually that they will be safe, that they will get to the other end of the pool, even if it's like a doggy paddle. And that's your responsibility to teach them to swim. Because if not, just like dropping them into the deep end of the pool and walking away, you will let them drown if you don't give them that skill set.
I'm going to have to remember that because that is so much better than what I tell my parents, which is the question you should be asking, but did they die or are they going to die? And if the
Right.
answer
Once
is
again,
no, then butt out.
right,
So, okay,
right.
Eve, softer approach. Noted. This is
No,
helpful.
no, but
Put
Okay.
the
that's
velvet
it.
back on the hammer, Eve.
Yeah.
Right. That's
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
My child, didn't study like they were supposed to, even though I told them to. They got a C. They're now worried that their GPA is going to go down. They have to go talk to the teacher. Go talk to the teacher about it. Did they die? No. You don't have to step in this situation. Let them deal with the teacher, and maybe their GPA is going to take a hit this semester.
Oh,
That's,
but that's hard for parents. They
it is.
really, they're like,
Right.
oh, I'm like, it's not
Also,
your GPA, it's theirs.
for
I know.
any listeners that are not subscribed to the YouTube channel, they should go on and watch how Eve just spewed water at that. That was great. I loved it. That was fantastic. I have a question, and I'm not sure that I totally understand this, so I'm going to ask the expert. You have talked a little bit about, and again, correct me if I've got this wrong, but how attention bias influences how kids look at the world,
Mhm.
what they focus on, and can either increase or decrease the risk for anxiety. What does all that mean?
Sure. So that's a bit jargony and it's in the lab. Um, we can take a step back and think about it. All of us, as we navigate our social world, there is so much happening around us, right? Even me in the room I'm in, or when I'm walking down campus, there are cars coming and going. There are people in very unusual military uniforms on this campus. There are podcasts I could be listening to. There are things I'm thinking about. There is too much for me to focus in on any one time. If I'm not going to be paralyzed in any one spot, I have to have selective attention. I have to decide, what am I looking at? What am I processing? What am I thinking about in any one time? And sometimes we deal with that with children, who are on the attention deficit spectrum or ASD, where they can't seem to figure out, right, where they're looking and where they're attending to and where they are mentally in any one moment. Often with kids who are temperamentally fearful, you see almost the opposite problem. They are so fixated on looking for and finding things in their environment that are negative, potentially threatening, things that are uncomfortable for them, and they will find them, right? So you could have two kids in a classroom, they come home, they say, "How did school go?" "It was great. We did a class project. The teacher asked me to stand up and tell them about my special toy. So and so tried to play with me, but I don't like them that much, so I didn't." And life is beautiful. The same child, a different child in the same classroom might go, "It was horrible. We had to do a class project. I had to talk to people. The teacher pointed at me and made me stand up and talk to everybody. She must hate me. And then so and so, I didn't want to play with them because they're awful. And none of the kids want to play with me either." It's the same room, but the child is attending to different signals and interpreting them in different ways. And a child who has a bias to attend to threat and interpret the world as threatening, as I said earlier, it's a quite logical response. You withdraw, You refuse to engage. You say, I'm not going to school. You can't make me. I'm not going to tumbling class. I'm not, I have decided that the world out there isn't safe, isn't making me feel good. So I'm not going to engage with them. I'm not going to talk to strangers. At the extreme, I'm going to, not talk to anybody. Selective mutism, right? Um, they see the world as a place that's not safe for them, and they're not going to engage, and they keep looking for evidence, and that evidence keeps reinforcing that belief. And often what we try to do with children like that is to figure out a way to get them to rejiggle the evidence that they're using about their environment, to balance out. Yes, some things about their environment isn't awesome, but other things are really cool. And there are kids out there who do want to play with you. And you can talk to people, and it is going to feel a little uncomfortable, but you'll make it through to the other end, and you might even meet a new friend. You might.
Yeah, and that makes that particular student so vulnerable for being labeled by the teacher as,
Mhm.
just a difficult kid.
Yes.
And then classmates are, you're negative, you're negative person. So I think
Mhm.
it's really important in just helping educators and teachers understand these stylistic differences
Right.
and understanding them not from a pejorative perspective, but more of an understanding and knowing how to connect with that student so the class experience can become a positive one. And like you said, it does reroute kind of that experience for the student.
Right. And in many ways, and I know this is a big burden on both parents and teachers, educating peers that kids are different. Because what
Yeah.
we sometimes see is that, the quintessentially temperamentally withdrawn child, kids will make social bids. Hey, do you want to play? Hey, do you want to go over here to the block corner? You get told no enough times, they stop asking. Oh, he's not nice. He doesn't like to play with anybody. Later on, they'll say, oh, she's stuck up, right? And it's just this fundamental fear of social interaction. Same thing with the overly exuberant child who kind of takes over the social scene. After a while, the other kids get tired. Uh-oh, he's coming over. He's gonna like take over the blocks, or he's gonna make us play the thing he wants to play. The teacher has to educate the peers and the child about these personality differences and how we can adapt to each other. So we all get a turn and we all get to play, but we don't get to have to play when we don't feel like it, and we don't always have to be in charge.
You've said that some children are born at risk for anxiety, but
Mhm.
not all will become anxious.
Yeah.
Why do only a subset of those kiddos end up developing anxiety?
I think this goes back to something we talked about a little earlier in terms of temperament being probability, right? So if you think about it from one perspective, temperamentally shy, extreme children have a six-fold increase to showing clinical social anxiety by adolescence. So it's our best known individual difference factor as a predictor. And that's like, oh no, six times a risk. That's awful. If you take the very same data set and just flip the way you look at it, it's about 40 to 50%. It's a flip of a coin, right? So your child is not doomed to be socially anxious. And what we tend to find is there are a couple things that happen over time. One of the easiest things we found, and it's almost like exposure therapy, like we talked earlier, kids who go to preschool, kids who have daycare, kids who go on play dates have a lower risk because they are literally confronted with the social world and they learn to deal with it. Kids are unpredictable. They take your toys, they break your crayons, they eat their boogers. They are acting in ways that you don't know how to deal with, but you learn over time. And it is by going into these social settings early that you learn how to do that. It's a little harder when you're 7 or 8 or 9 learning these skills. So that's one. Two is that sensitive parenting we talked about, slowly scaffolding the child to interact with the social world, developmentally appropriate, slow and steady, time over time over time. The child is learning these skills. Just last weekend, I was watching the New York City Marathon, right? Nobody gets up Sunday morning and says, you know what? I'm going to run the 5 boroughs of New York City today. You'll die. But A year ago, you could have gotten up and said, you know what? I want to run a marathon next year. I'm going to take the next 365 days and slowly and surely and systematically train myself to run a marathon. Parents unknowingly are training their children to engage with the social world.
I like that.
They are helping them scaffold their way through that. And then three is the child is maturing. The child is learning new skills as the brain matures, executive functioning, cognitive control, all of these regulatory processes that the frontal lobe kind of helps out kicks in. And the child is learning through memory, through regulatory processes, how to deal with what's happening outside in the outside world. And it's only really for a small percentage of kids that those things in combination just aren't enough. And it is those children that you see in a clinic. It is those children that need more systematic support, whether it be parent education or child-directed interventions. That really is a smaller slice of the population.
I know it's been a limited interaction with us, but can you name our temperaments? Have we shown enough of
No,
our personalities?
no, no, because that's the thing.
Uh-huh.
Part of it is you have to see over time and um, like I said, I for an hour can put on the mask of a socially engaged, with it person. It's not going to last all day. By 7 o'clock, I'm in my pajamas with the lights turned off, with some Skittles. Um, and I think but that's okay because our personalities have to reflect the way we've learned to adapt with our world from social setting to social setting. Same thing with our children. We're teaching them what's appropriate in school, what's appropriate when we go to the neighborhood school, what's appropriate when we go to a concert or to a religious ceremony. We bring our personalities with us, but our behavior has to change.
Just want to say that Dr. Koraly handled that curveball from Eve really well.
Just
Nice job.
wondering. I think I
Just
know
wondering.
mine.
Just wondering.
Well, you
Um,
know yours, Steve.
before we're getting towards the end of our
Mhm.
time, I know, but before I go to the takeaways, you've talked a little bit about the overprotecting our kids, the bubble of safety being a trap, and is it too much for them? But like, also, I love the New York City Marathon analogy, but like, if you're a parent, it's really hard to watch your kid struggle, especially for if it's going to be a marathon. So, what if it's too much for us? Like, you have a parent listening, and like, I just can't watch my kid suffer, and
Mhm.
it's so hard. What any words of encouragement or guidance or words of wisdom?
I think it's really important to and I have now I have flashback memories. One of my children had particularly difficulty with social interactions. Middle school and high school was just rough, right? And you could see what was going wrong, but you couldn't stop it, because you're not there in the moment. I think for a parent, you have to understand that your own well-being is really important, that your ability to scaffold and take care of and support your child is in part dependent on your ability to take care of yourself, right? Um, that your sense of well-being, if you are exhausted at the end of your rope, frazzled, you will not be Mary Poppins, highly sensitive and kind to your child. Then it's a negative impact on both of you. So there is sometimes a kindness to your child to focus on yourself. Recharge
Yeah.
your battery, understand what's happening. Why are you anxious? Why are you snapping? Why are you upset? So that then when that trigger comes, and we all know our children are triggering, we can then better respond, right? And then we have that charged battery that we can deplete just a little to help our child. And that will change over time. And I think the parent who tries to make it through 25 years of parenting without going back and forth, stepping back, stepping forward, is going to drop from exhaustion
Yeah.
or will become resentful of the child. And in the end, ironically, make it worse. So if you have a difficult child, if you have a highly reactive child, if you have the highly shy child who will not leave your side, it is exhausting. It is hard for you. But if your response is to act harshly in a way that just reinforces that behavior on the part of the child, that cycle will be very hard to break.
Thank you for that. Kind of along those lines, as we wrap up our time together, you have any two or three takeaways you'd like parents to remember when it comes to your work, temperament, anxiety, attention?
Sure. So one of my mentors, Jerry Kagan, had um this quote where he talks about genetics, because temperament is partially genetically based. And what he said is genetics create the foundation of a home, right? Of your house. It is up to you to then build the house upon it. And that house can look differently based on where you live, what you need as a family, the culture, the environment, the climate. So don't think that your child is this stone that is unmoldable. It is clay. You can mold your child over time. I would then add to what he would say by saying, but don't think you can turn clay into glass, right? If you have a shy child, you can work with them to bring them out, to help them make two or three close friends. But don't be despondent that they are not class president, homecoming queen, and you, by God, will make them into that exuberant, happy go lucky person because you could break the child trying to do that. Same thing in the reverse. Um, and remember that there will come change. Change will come, but it's not going to happen in a day, a month, or a year. You're going to turn around one day and look into the eyes of your 15-year-old. Well, you're going to look up because they're going to be taller than you by then. And you're going to say, my God, look at all that happened in the last decade. You and I were in the trenches together, but look at all the good skills you have now. Look at the way you're growing into your own independent person. I'm still there for you. I'm not abandoning you. But a decade of change has happened. And I helped you move through that decade. I didn't leave you back there with the skills of a 5-year-old, but I see you as the 15-year-old growing into the man or the woman you will become. You're only going to notice it after the decade. A random Tuesday isn't going to give you that.
Mhm.
That's great.
So-
Thank you. I
Hmm.
was thinking about you had said, remember, I think that you said something along these lines, remember the goal to raise curious, confident, and connected kids. And then, as you just pointed out, take the long view too towards adults. And then, can our listeners please remember, I think this is another of your quotes, and I want you to remember Dr. Howson on stage with his kid when you hear this in your head. Don't remove the child from the difficult moment. Help them stay in it long enough to discover I can handle this. And
Yes.
then Dr. Matthew Howson standing up on stage. That is
Hmm.
fantastic. I may never forget that. Thank you.
And that
Um,
same child is the one that jumped out of the airplane, by the way.
that makes sense. No, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Hmm.
Dr. Koraly Pérez-Edgar, this has been a fantastic episode. I know this is our listeners are going to take a lot away from this. Can you share a little bit about what's next for your research and interest, and then where can parents engage with your work?
Sure. So, um, one of the things that we've learned in the last couple of years that's really kind of amazing, is that individuals synchronize their bodily signals when they're interacting with each other. So, for example, when you and your child are doing a puzzle together, your neural brain waves actually synchronize. You don't notice it. It's not something that you would ever know is happening, but it happens. And what we're trying to figure out is what does that mean and does it matter? And we know there are differences in level of synchrony when a parent is depressed or when a child has gone through maltreatment in the past. And we're trying to figure out, is this the way that our minds, our brains, while not physically connected, act as a biological conduit for how does parenting jump from one brain into the brain of the child over time? So in my lab, we're starting to look at that and figuring out, does it matter? How does it shape development? Because so often we look at the child as this like free floating blob, right? We look at their temperament, we look at their behavior, we look at their genetics, and we kind of forget they're actually living in a social world, that everything they do is in interaction with each other. So we're really trying to focus on that in the coming years. A lot of my work, unfortunately, is boring and dry and in scientific journals. But by doing podcasts like this and pointing people to more accessible parenting books that some of my colleagues have written, I think there is ways for parents to take this information in and apply it. There's a great book that just came out recently called Parenting Based on the Temperament of Your Child, and Liliana Lengua from the University of Washington is one of the co-authors, and I find that really helpful, um, because each child is so unique across families, within families. One of the jokes we have is like, you believe temperament is real when you have your second child, when all the tricks and tips you thought worked beautifully for your first fall flat with the second one, who's like, what is this? I don't understand what you're doing here. Um, it's a learning experience. It's a tap dance sometimes.
That's I walk into every room of second time parents and say, okay, so you guys have got this all figured out, right? And like, no, we
No,
don't. Excellent.
no, yeah.
Uh, that was fantastic. So appreciate your time with us today. And we look forward to staying in touch with you. So thanks for being on Parenting for the Present, and appreciate your time.